The flashing lights hit first, red, then blue, slicing through the quiet street like a warning that something ordinary was about to turn irreversible. It was just past sunset. The kind of hour when the day hadn't fully let go, when the sky still carried a faint gold line above the rooftops. The street was calm. Residential. No crowds. No chaos. Just the soft hum of traffic a few blocks away and the echo of distant sirens fading into routine. The black sedan rolled to a stop without hesitation. Inside, the man in the driver's seat remained still. Calm. Hands visible on the steering wheel. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't confused. He wasn't afraid that he had done nothing wrong. 2 patrol cars stopped behind him. Doors opened with exaggerated force. Boots hit pavement. Radios crackled. The officers were young, both of them. New uniforms, stiff posture, voices that carried the sharp edge of borrowed authority. They approached like men rehearsing a scene they'd played in their heads too many times. License and registration. The first one barked, already leaning too close. The man in the driver's seat turned his head slightly, measured, respectful. He reached slowly into the glove compartment and handed over the documents without a word. The second officer glanced at the name on the ID, then he laughed, not a quiet chuckle. A sharp, open laugh, the kind meant to be heard. "Man," he said, holding the card up like a joke. "You serious right now?" The driver didn't respond. "You expect us to believe this?" the officer added, turning the ID toward his partner. "You really out here pretending to be a judge?" The word pretending hung in the air. The driver finally spoke. His voice was steady. "Controlled, that's my identification." The first officer stepped closer, lowering his voice with mock authority. "You think because you got a little piece of plastic, you can lie to police?" The second officer smirked. "You got jokes, man. Real funny." Neither of them noticed the dash camera blinking red, neither noticed the quiet phones lifting from nearby parked cars, neighbors drawn by raised voices and flashing lights. The driver didn't raise his voice. Didn't argue. Didn't flinch. He simply said, "I'm asking you to check it properly." That's when the mood shifted. The first officer scoffed. "You don't tell us what to do." His hand moved toward his belt, not his weapon, but close enough to make the message clear. "You're gonna step out of the vehicle," he ordered. "For what reason?" the man asked calmly. "For suspicion." "Suspicion of what?" The pause that followed was brief, but telling. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." The car door opened slowly. The man stepped out, still calm, still composed. No resistance. No raised voice. No sudden movement. The second officer circled behind him, already reaching for handcuffs. A few feet away, a woman across the street whispered to someone on her phone, "They're arresting him for nothing." The officer twisted the man's arm behind his back. "That's unnecessary," the man said, wincing slightly but not raising his voice. "You should have thought about that before lying to us." The first officer snapped. Metal clicked shut. The sound was loud. Final. Passers-by stopped walking. A car slowed. Someone started recording openly now, phone held high. The man stood there, cuffed, composed, his expression unreadable, but his eyes steady. Not afraid. Not angry, just waiting. One of the officers shook his head, almost amused. "Man really thought he could play judge today." The other laughed. "Yeah. People watch too much TV." They began leading him toward the patrol car, the situation already spiraling into something far larger than they realized. None of them noticed the incoming call lighting up the man's phone inside the vehicle. The caller ID read, "Chief Justice, Court ADM. The phone kept ringing, and ringing, and ringing. The officers didn't look back. They had already decided who he was, and that decision, made in arrogance, in assumption, in quiet contempt, was about to detonate everything they thought they understood about power, authority, and consequence. The patrol car door slammed shut with a hollow thud that echoed down the quiet street. Inside the back seat, the man sat upright, wrists cuffed in front of him, posture still composed. His breathing was steady, measured. Not a single word left his mouth as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. Outside, the street returned to its uneasy stillness, but the tension had already traveled with them. The two officers climbed into the front seats, adrenaline still buzzing. The younger one behind the wheel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Unbelievable, he muttered. Guy really thought we'd buy that. The senior officer snorted. They always think they're smarter than us. Fake IDs, fake titles. Same story every time. The radio crackled with routine chatter. Neither officer responded. The cruiser rolled through traffic, lights still on, siren now silent, a quiet show of authority meant to be felt, not heard. I in the back seat, the man shifted slightly, the cuffs pressing into his wrists. His gaze drifted out the window, watching the city slide past. Stores. Crosswalks. People living their ordinary lives, unaware that something was unfolding that would ripple far beyond this moment. The phone in his jacket buzzed again, then again. The officers noticed someone popular tonight, the driver said with a smirk, glancing in the mirror. The man didn't answer. The phone finally went silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of tires on asphalt. Then the senior officer spoke again. More serious now. Let's see what you're really hiding, he said. Running your name now. He tapped the screen mounted between the seats. The system loaded slowly. The man in the back didn't look worried. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He simply waited, as if time itself were on his side. The patrol car slowed at a red light. On the sidewalk, a woman stared openly through the glass, her phone raised, recording. Her face tightened as she watched the cuffs, the calm expression of the man inside, the casual posture of the officers. The light turned green, the car rolled on. Inside the system, the officer frowned. What? The driver asked. Database is lagging, he said. Probably nothing. He refreshed it. The screen blinked, then froze, then refreshed again. The officer leaned closer, his brow tightening. That's weird. What? The driver asked, impatience creeping into his voice. The officer didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the screen more carefully now. The earlier confidence began to thin. Names coming back flagged, he said slowly. Flagged how? The driver asked. The officer hesitated. Not sure yet. They drove in silence for another block. The radio crackled again, louder this time. Unit 12, status check. The driver pressed the button. Transporting suspect to precinct. Everything's under control. A pause. Copy that. Be advised, we're seeing some unusual activity tied to that name. Stand by. The driver's jaw tightened. The man in the back seat finally spoke. May I make a suggestion? He said calmly. Both officers tensed. No, the driver snapped. You may not. The man nodded slightly, unfazed. Silence returned, heavier now. They pulled into the station parking lot, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. As the car rolled to a stop, the building doors slid open automatically, revealing a few officers inside who looked up, curious. The two officers stepped out first, confidence returning as the familiar setting surrounded them. They opened the back door. Out, the senior officer ordered. The man stepped out slowly. As his feet touched the ground, a uniformed desk sergeant inside the station glanced over, then froze. His eyes locked onto the man, the color drained from his face. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back. Sir, he said, disbelief cutting through his voice. The two arresting officers turned. What? The driver asked, irritated. The desk sergeant didn't answer him. His gaze stayed fixed on the man in cuffs. Is everything okay? The sergeant asked, voice suddenly careful. The man met his eyes calmly. No, he said. It isn't. The room went quiet. Phones stopped ringing. Keyboards went still. A few officers leaned back in their chairs, watching. The senior arresting officer scoffed. You know him or something? The desk sergeant swallowed. Yes, he said slowly. I do. He glanced at the cuffs, then back at the man's face. And you need to take those off. Now. The temperature in the room dropped. The two arresting officers stared at him. What are you talking about? The driver demanded. This guy lied about who he was. The desk sergeant shook his head, voice tight. No, he said. He didn't. The man in cuffs finally spoke again, his voice steady but unmistakably firm. "You might want to call your watch commander." Silence, the kind that stretches, the kind that signals something irreversible has just begun. The room felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the balance of power had. The two arresting officers stood rigid, uncertainty creeping into their posture. The desk sergeant hadn't moved since he spoke, his eyes still locked on the man in cuffs like he was staring at a ghost that had just remembered how to breathe. The driver scoffed, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "This is getting ridiculous," he said. "You're telling me this guy's special now? Because he said so?" The desk sergeant didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the cuffs again, then at the man's face, then at the name still glowing faintly on his terminal screen that he swallowed. "You need to uncuff him," he said again, quieter now. Firmer, the second officer took a step forward. "Sergeant, with respect, we detained him for obstruction and false identification." Stop," the sergeant snapped. The word cracked through the room, sharp enough to turn heads across the station. The officer froze mid-sentence. "I said stop." The sergeant stood slowly, smoothing his uniform like he was buying time. His voice dropped. "You don't understand what you've done." The driver's jaw clenched. "We followed procedure." "No," the sergeant replied. "You followed assumption." The room fell into a thick, uncomfortable silence. Behind them, the man in cuffs remained calm, eyes forward, posture straight. Not defiant. Not pleading. Waiting. The sergeant turned back to the terminal, fingers moving fast now, pulling up additional records. His eyes widened slightly as the screen populated. He leaned closer, then leaned back. "Sir," he said carefully, turning toward the man in cuffs. "I need to ask you something." The man nodded once. "Have you been scheduled to appear at the courthouse today?" The man met his gaze. "Yes." The sergeant swallowed hard. "Did you, by any chance, arrive early?" A quiet beat passed. "Yes," the man said. "I was on my way." The room felt like it lost oxygen. The driver took a step back. "This is a joke," he muttered. "This has to be some database error." The sergeant shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "It's not." He turned the screen toward the two officers. They leaned in, and froze. The color drained from their faces as they read what was in front of them. One of them whispered, "No way." The other took a step back, bumping into a chair. That can't be him." The sergeant exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "It is," he said. Silence slammed down again, heavier than before. The man in cuffs spoke quietly. "You may want to remove those now." Neither officer moved. Their authority, moments ago worn so casually, was unraveling in real time. The badge that once gave them certainty now felt heavy, useless. The sergeant's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Do it. Now." The junior officer fumbled with the cuffs, hands suddenly unsteady. Metal clicked open, the sound echoed like a verdict. The man rolled his wrists slowly, flexing them once. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted his sleeves. Across the room, an officer whispered, "Oh my God." Another muttered, "We're finished." But the man didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't insult. He stepped forward calmly and met the eyes of the two officers who had arrested him. "Sit down," he said quietly. They hesitated, then obeyed. Chairs scraped the floor as they Saturday. The shift in power was complete. The man turned to the sergeant. "Please notify your watch commander. And internal affairs." The sergeant nodded immediately. "Already on it." The man exhaled slowly, then looked back at the two officers. "Do you know why this is serious?" he asked them. Neither answered. "Because this wasn't a misunderstanding," he continued. "This was assumption. Bias. And misuse of authority." The room was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. "You didn't stop me because of a violation," he said evenly. "You stopped me because you decided who I was before asking who I am." The officers stared at the floor. "I complied. I stayed calm. I followed your instructions," he went on. "And still, you escalated." The sergeant shifted uncomfortably. "This is exactly how trust erodes," the man said. quietly. Moment by moment. The radio crackled again. "Command is on the line," a voice announced from the front desk. "They want a full report. Now." The sergeant picked up the phone with trembling hands. "Yes, sir," he said. "He's here." A pause. "Yes, yes, I understand." He hung up slowly. "They're on their way," he said to the room. "Everyone stay where you are." The man nodded once, then took a seat nearby. Composed as ever, the two officers sat frozen, staring straight ahead, their earlier confidence completely stripped away. Outside, the station's glass doors reflected the flashing red and blue lights still spinning in the lot. Inside, the reality settled in. This wasn't going away, this was only the beginning. The station doors slid open with a hydraulic hiss, every head turned. Two uniformed officers stepped aside as a small group entered, not rushing, not dramatic, but carrying the kind of quiet gravity that bent the room around them. At the front walked a woman in a tailored navy suit, posture immaculate, expression unreadable. Behind her, a senior command officer and a man in a dark blazer with a departmental seal stitched subtly at the chest. The room went still, the desk sergeant straightened instinctively. The arresting officers remained seated, stiff as stone. The woman's eyes scanned the room once, taking everything in, the cuffs on the desk, the open terminals, the man seated calmly near the wall. Then her gaze locked onto him. "Judge Harris," she said. The words landed like a controlled detonation. Every breath in the room seemed to stop. The man rose slowly, respectfully. "Director Lewis." The two arresting officers stared in open disbelief. "Judge, not a nickname. Not a joke. A federal circuit judge." The realization hit them not like a slap, but like the floor dropping out from under their feet. Director Lewis turned slightly, her expression still composed, but her voice sharpened. "Why is a sitting federal judge in handcuffs inside a precinct?" No one answered. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. The desk sergeant cleared his throat. "Ma'am, there appears to have been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," she repeated, quietly. Her eyes shifted to the two officers. "Would either of you like to explain what led to this?" The driver swallowed hard. We conducted a traffic stop." The individual, the judge, presented identification. "We believed it to be fraudulent." "Based on what?" she asked. He hesitated. "It just didn't seem real." The room felt colder. "You didn't verify it?" she asked. "We were in the process of." "You handcuffed a federal judge," she cut in, "before verification." Silence. She turned to the man seated calmly nearby. "Judge Harris, were you read your rights?" He shook his head. "No." "Were you informed of the reason for your detention?" "No." "Were you permitted to make a call?" He glanced toward the officers. "No." Director Lewis nodded once. Her jaw tightened, not in anger, in calculation. She turned back to the officers. "Do you understand what those answers mean?" Neither spoke. She continued, voice firm but measured. "You violated departmental policy, constitutional procedure, and basic protocol, all before confirming identity." One of the officers finally found his voice. "Ma'am, we thought," she interrupted, "is not the standard." She stepped forward, her tone calm but surgical. "You assumed. You escalated. You restrained. And you ignored multiple opportunities to de-escalate." The room felt smaller with every word. The judge stood silently, hands folded, letting the truth speak for itself. Director Lewis turned to the desk sergeant. "Has Internal Affairs been notified?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied quickly. "They're en route." "Good." She turned back to the two officers. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of duty pending investigation." The words landed heavy. "Hand over your badges and service weapons." The officers froze. "Now," she said, slowly, almost mechanically. They unholstered their weapons and placed them on the desk. Then their badges. The sound of metal touching wood echoed loudly in the quiet room. The judge watched, not with satisfaction, but with something closer to resolve. The officers stood there, stripped of authority in the very place they once commanded. Director Lewis turned to the judge again. "On behalf of the department, I apologize." He inclined his head slightly. Acknowledged. She continued, a full report will be filed. Body cam footage, dispatch records, and witness accounts will be preserved. The judge nodded. As they should be. She hesitated, then added, if you wish to make a statement. He raised a hand gently. Later. A beat passed, the room exhaled. One of the junior officers, standing near the doorway, looked shaken. I've never seen this before, he murmured. Director Lewis glanced at him. Then learn from it. She turned back to the two suspended officers. You're to remain here until Internal Affairs arrives. Do not leave this room. They nodded, defeated. The judge walked toward the exit, unhurried. As he passed the desk sergeant, he stopped. You did the right thing once you realized, he said quietly. The sergeant nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, sir. The judge reached the doorway, then paused. He turned back, his voice steady but carrying weight. This isn't about me, he said. It's about what happens when power goes unchecked, and when people forget who the law is meant to protect. No one spoke. He stepped through the doors. The station remained frozen in silence long after he was gone. Outside, night had fully fallen. Red and blue lights reflected off glass and asphalt, but their meaning had changed. Inside, careers hung in the balance, and somewhere deeper than fear or embarrassment, something else had begun to stir: accountability. The building didn't return to normal after he left. It couldn't. The fluorescent lights still hummed. The phones still rang. Officers still moved through the halls. But something fundamental had shifted, like the air itself had been altered. Inside the briefing room, the two suspended officers sat in silence, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. Their weapons and badges lay on the table in front of them, no longer symbols of authority, but evidence. The door opened again. This time, it wasn't quiet. Two Internal Affairs investigators entered, flanked by a legal liaison carrying a sealed folder. Their presence carried weight, the kind that turned routine misconduct into something far more serious. Let's begin, one of them said, setting the folder down. A recorder clicked on. Time stopped. Officer Daniels, the investigator said, looking directly at the driver. You are being questioned regarding the unlawful detention, search, and restraint of a civilian earlier this evening. Daniels swallowed. I was acting in good faith. Good faith does not negate procedure, the investigator replied calmly. Especially when constitutional rights are involved. The other investigator turned to the second officer. Officer Grant, do you wish to have representation present? Grant hesitated, then nodded. Yes. The investigator nodded once. Noted. The room felt smaller with every word spoken. Elsewhere in the building, phones rang non-stop. A lieutenant paced near the administrative wing, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, sir, yes, I understand. No, sir, we were not informed ahead of time. Yes, Internal Affairs is handling it. He paused, listening. Yes, sir. The judge was cooperative. No, there were no injuries. Yes. I understand the optics. He lowered the phone slowly, exhaling through his nose. Across town, a quiet chain reaction had begun. Body cam footage was being pulled, dash cam footage queued for review, dispatch logs were frozen, every timestamp, every transmission, every moment was now preserved. Nothing could be walked back. In a small conference room, the chief of police sat with the city's legal counsel. Neither spoke for a long moment. This is going to be public, the chief finally said. The lawyer nodded. It already is. The chief closed his eyes briefly. Get ahead of it, he said. Full transparency. No statements until we review everything. The lawyer hesitated. There's something else. The chief looked up. The judge, he's well respected. His rulings on civil liberties are widely cited. The chief sighed. Of course they are. Back at the station, the two officers sat alone now. No phones. No radios. No badges. The weight of what they had done began to settle, not as panic, but as something worse, realization. They hadn't just made a bad stop, they had violated a man whose entire career was built on enforcing the very principles they ignored, and it had all been captured, by cameras, by witnesses, by systems designed to remember. One officer finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're done, aren't we?" The other didn't answer. Down the hall, the desk sergeant leaned against the wall, eyes closed, replaying every moment. The hesitation. The doubt. The moment he'd almost spoken up sooner. He exhaled sharply. He knew better, everyone did. That was the worst part. Elsewhere in the city, a small group had gathered outside the station. Not angry. Not shouting, just watching. Some held phones. Others stood with arms crossed. The footage had already begun circulating, a clip from a nearby car, a snippet of audio, a glimpse of the cuffs. Online, speculation spread quickly, but the tone was different than usual, less outrage, more disappointment. The story wasn't about chaos. It was about trust, and how easily it could be broken. Inside the station, the chief finally stepped into the briefing room. The suspended officers stood automatically, at ease. He said, they didn't sit. He looked at them. For a long moment before speaking. "I've spent my entire career trying to build something that the public can believe in," he said quietly. "And tonight, you damaged that." Neither officer spoke. "You will be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation," he continued. "Your actions will be reviewed by Internal Affairs, the city, and the Civilian Oversight Board." He paused. "And whatever comes next, will be based on facts." He turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he added, "this didn't have to happen." The door closed behind him. The officers stood alone in the silence, finally understanding the full weight of what they'd done. Outside, the night pressed on. News vans began to arrive, lights flashed, cameras rolled, and somewhere across the city, the man they had arrested sat in a quiet room, speaking calmly with officials, not about revenge, not about punishment, but about process, accountability, and what should happen next. The system had been challenged. Now it had to respond. The meeting room on the top floor of City Hall was silent in a way that felt deliberate. No phones, no reporters, no posturing, just a long table, a line of officials, and a truth that had finally reached the surface. At the head sat the judge, no robe, no gavel, no title announced, just a man who had seen what happened when authority forgot its limits. Around him were people who shaped policy rather than enforced it: the police chief, city attorneys, internal affairs leadership, a representative from the mayor's office, and the director of civilian oversight. The door closed. "This isn't about punishment," the judge began calmly. "It's about correction." No one interrupted. "For years, we've treated misconduct as an individual failure instead of a systemic one," he continued. "We wait for incidents, then react. We apologize. We suspend. We move on." He paused, letting the words settle. "That approach is no longer acceptable." The police chief shifted in his seat. "We understand the severity of what occurred." The judge met his eyes. "Do you understand why it happened?" The room went still. The chief hesitated. "Because officers failed to follow protocol." "That's the symptom," the judge replied. "Not the disease." He leaned forward slightly. "The disease is assumption. Bias. Comfort with power that goes unchallenged." Silence followed. The judge continued, his voice steady but firm. "You train for threat response. You train for escalation. But you do not train enough for restraint." A few heads nodded reluctantly. "Accountability can't only appear when something goes wrong," he said. "It has to be present when nothing appears wrong at all." The director of civilian oversight spoke next. "What are you proposing?" The judge folded his hands. "Immediate procedural reform. Independent review of all stops involving detention without probable cause. Mandatory recertification on constitutional conduct. Body camera audits, not selectively, but randomly." The room absorbed the words, and, he added, public transparency. A murmur spread. "You want footage released?" someone asked. "When legally permissible," the judge replied. "Yes." The police chief leaned forward. "That will create backlash." "It already has," the judge said calmly. The question is whether you want trust restored or merely managed. Silence, then the chief nodded slowly. We'll do it. The judge exhaled, not in relief, but resolve. Across the city, changes were already unfolding. Emails went out to precinct commanders outlining mandatory retraining, schedules were adjusted, oversight committees were convened. In quiet offices, officers watched training videos they'd seen before, but this time with a different understanding of what failure looked like. In roll calls, supervisors spoke with a seriousness that hadn't been there before. This isn't about fear, one sergeant told his unit. It's about standards. The message spread. Meanwhile, the two officers at the center of the incident remained suspended. Their names weren't broadcast, but everyone knew. They sat in limbo, not punished yet, not cleared, forced to confront the weight of their actions without the noise of public outrage to distract them. One of them began to understand something he hadn't before. Power wasn't just something you held. It was something you were trusted with, and trust, once broken, demanded more than regret. Across town, the judge met quietly with community leaders, not for cameras, not for statements, just listening. He heard frustration, fear, fatigue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He took notes. When he finally spoke, it was simple: this only matters if it changes something. The room agreed. Days turned into weeks, new policies were drafted, training modules rewritten, oversight expanded, not because of outrage, but because ignoring the problem had become impossible, and for the first time in a long time, the system wasn't reacting to noise. It was responding to truth. The judge returned to his courtroom shortly after that. He took the bench as he always had. No announcement. No applause, just quiet acknowledgement from those who understood what had happened beyond the headlines. Justice, in this moment, wasn't loud. It was deliberate, measured, and finally, accountable. The courtroom was quiet in the way only old buildings can be, not silent, but reverent. The kind of quiet shaped by years of truth spoken aloud. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long lines across the polished floor. The judge sat alone for a moment before the session began, hands folded, eyes steady. There was no tension in his posture. Only resolve. Outside, life moved on, cars passed. People talked. News cycles shifted to newer stories, louder stories, but something had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to matter. The system had been forced to look at itself. The officers involved would face their own outcomes through due process. Careers weighed. Decisions examined. Consequences delivered, not with spectacle, but with structure. No public shaming. No shortcuts, because justice, real justice, didn't need theater. It needed honesty. Across the city, the effects rippled quietly. In briefing rooms, officers listened more closely. In training sessions, instructors spoke less about authority and more about responsibility. In patrol cars, there were pauses, small ones, before commands were given, before assumptions were made. That pause mattered. The judge knew that change didn't arrive all at once. It arrived in moments, when someone chose restraint instead of reaction, humility instead of ego, patience instead of power. He had seen what happened when those moments were ignored, and he had seen what could happen when they weren't. One evening, long after the headlines had faded, he walked past the courthouse steps as the sun dipped low. A few people recognized him. One nodded in quiet respect. Another simply said, "Thank you." He nodded back, nothing more, because the truth was, this had never been about him. It was about the line between authority and accountability, and how easily it could blur if left unchecked. It was about the people who never get the benefit of doubt, the ones whose voices don't always carry weight, the ones who are expected to endure injustice quietly. That night, the judge sat alone in his office, reviewing case files for the next day. He paused, looking at the seal on the wall. Justice, not as an idea, not as a slogan, but as a responsibility. He thought of the officers, not with anger, but with a sober understanding of how quickly power can distort when it isn't challenged. He thought of the systems that had protected some while failing others, and he thought of what it meant to correct course, not perfectly, not completely, but deliberately. The city would forget the details eventually. Most people always did, but systems remembered, policies shifted, training changed, and somewhere, someone who might have once been stopped unfairly would now be treated differently, not because of fear, but because accountability had taken root. That was the real impact, not the headlines, not the outrage, but the quiet recalibration of power. The judge closed his file and stood, turning off the light behind him. Outside, the city breathed, complicated, imperfect, alive. Justice didn't roar. It didn't chase applause. It worked slowly, carefully, in moments most people never saw, and sometimes, that was enough, because when accountability is real, it doesn't need to announce itself. It simply changes what happens next.